Jack is going to fill up all of our time. Okay? Okay, so, thank you.
Well, a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is material that I gathered while I was at the State Department. And as long as you give somebody at the State Department 3 talking points, they can talk for an unlimited amount of time. So I did spend 13 years traveling around the world talking about the future of food and agriculture, the role of science and technology, and how to better communicate about it. And so I think that's a really important topic as we get into today, because you're going to hear a lot about great science and scientific advances today. But the question is, will those scientific advances ever reach market? And it's only going to happen if we figure out a way of communicating these benefits to the public. Now, the title of my talk is, Can Agriculture Save the Planet Before It Destroys It? I'm not sure that I'm going to answer that question today, because it's our conversation that's going to determine whether or not we're able to do that. I have no doubt that science and technology can get us where we need to go, but I'm not at all sure we'll be allowed to go there. I tell people I'm a science optimist, but a regulatory pessimist. So we'll see how that goes. Now, in many ways, there's nothing we do that has a bigger, more negative impact on the planet than agriculture, but there's nothing more critical for our daily survival. So we start from the challenge how to grow the benefits and reduce the negatives. And so just to put that in perspective, if we were to talk about land, 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So in terms of land, there's nothing bigger than agriculture, and the footprint is as big, if not bigger, than it should be. If we were to talk about water, well, you probably all know that 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture. This is the Aral Sea back in 1973. If you fast forward to today, it's no longer really a sea at all, and that's because of agricultural withdrawals. Now, in the United States, the Colorado River, the 6th largest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these are not the challenges of 2050. These are the realities of today. If we were to talk about fisheries, well, you know far better than I do, 90% of fisheries are at risk or in decline. So the marine environment is also at substantial risk. If we were to talk about climate change, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from the ag sector, another 10 to 15% come from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. Well, that's about 25 to 30% of all greenhouse gases, which is almost as much as the energy sector, and it's more than anything else. And yet 90% of what we read about in newspapers is about energy policy, virtually nothing about food and agriculture. And yet for every dollar you spend on wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now those are critical long-term investments for our future. But for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world. Positive rates of return. So you have to wonder, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? From what I know of Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. This is off the record, right? No, that's okay. I'm not at the government anymore, I can say it. So the challenge, though, is how do we tell the story of food and agriculture in a way that people get? Now, you know we're going from 7 to 9 billion people by 2050, and that's a challenge. But we also know that there are 800 million people that will go to bed tonight hungry. That's a different challenge. There are 9 million people that will die this year of hunger. That's more than HIV, tuberculosis, road accidents, insect disease. You add them all up, and it's less than hunger. And how many headlines does that get? Not a lot. And that's because 9 million is a statistic, and it's really hard to wrap our minds around statistics that big. So that's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people over the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds. How do we bring that home, that these are real people? So we need 60, 70, some say 100% more food by 2050, and we have to do it using less land, less water, less fertilizer, and fewer insecticides. So we have to do everything better tomorrow than we're doing it today, and our rivers and lakes are already running dry. That's a challenge. But it's also a challenge because we have the competing worldviews of how our food should be produced. There are those who believe, I got ahead of myself. The aquaculture point, which is we have to produce this food, and yet all of the gains in seafood have to come from aquaculture because there's no more room in the oceans. And so that's a challenge of where it's all going to come from. Because right now, we're getting all those omega-3s from the ocean by grinding up fish and feeding them fish. But how can you double something that's already 90% depleted? So that's a challenge. But it's a challenge for a different reason, and that's these competing worldviews. On one hand, you have people that think we should produce our food the way it was produced 100 years ago. On the other hand, you have high-tech, we need more intensive agriculture. And both of these are growing global trends. But if I can choose what goes on my local label, how do I trade it globally? So in some ways, these trends are moving in different directions. How do we bring them back together? That's part of what we're going to talk about. And these different choices about our different voices in how to produce our food lead to different choices in policy. So what we have here are a bunch of countries in Europe plus the US, China, India, and Brazil back in 1961. And so you look at the amount of food that these different countries are producing, and as you fast forward to 2005, what you see is China's producing a lot more food, the US and India are producing a fair amount additional food, Brazil's beginning to break away from the pack, but many European countries are not producing all that much more food than they were back in 1961. Now they're consuming more food, they're just not producing more food. So over the next 10 years, according to the OECD, Europe will increase its agricultural production by just under 4%, just ahead of sub-Saharan Africa. On the other hand, Brazil will increase its food production by 40%, driven by demand in its number one export market, Europe. So Europe has chosen low productivity agriculture in order to protect their local streams and forests. And the result is they've exported their agricultural footprint to arguably the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea. Choices and consequences. They can choose to do that because they can afford to buy it. But somebody will produce it. And that place that produces it may or may not be the better source of that food. Choices and consequences. Now, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place that people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together as family, as friends. And when you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. So it's not surprising that people would be concerned about the food they eat. If you can't articulate a reason somebody should want something, don't be surprised if they don't. So there's also this disconnect, though, between how our food is marketed and its reality. So you look at this picture and you think, oh, these are idyllic farms where the animals are happily led to slaughter. But this is dog food, right? I'm not sure that the dogs really care quite that much what the farms look like. They want to run on those farms, but they don't necessarily care what the packaging looks like. So we're marketed a vision of the food supply that may not be consistent with how our food is produced, and then we lament the fact that the public doesn't understand food production. Well, if you don't tell them what's happening, don't be surprised if they don't know what's happening. And so when they find out what's happening, they feel like they have been misled, and perhaps rightfully so. And that leads to skeptical consumers, and that has a lot of impacts. Now, I used to spend a lot of time talking about the science of risk. Now, I like science. I have 5 degrees in science, or 5 degrees, 4 of them in science. Don't be impressed. My wife has a PhD, so I'm all about quantity and she's quality. I know that in this room, everybody's going to go with the PhD quality route, so I'm not going to have that conversation. But I used to talk a lot about the science, and I would explain that hazard times exposure equals risk. And that, a hazard could be big, like a plane crash, but if your exposure is small, you don't really need to worry about that risk. On the other hand, the hazard of a car crash is much smaller, but your exposure is greater, and that's why they say it's sometimes riskier to drive than to fly. Well, we're hardwired to understand hazard. We are not hardwired to understand risk, unless you're a statistician. And nobody wants to talk to statisticians, unless you're in the statistics department. Don't worry, we'll get back to statisticians. They are actually the hero of the story. So that doesn't work. So if you can't talk about risk and you can't talk, what are you going to talk about? Well, what I've learned over my 13 years at the State Department is that you need to talk about hazard times media exposure equals perception of risk. People worry about what they read about. How could it be any different? How can you worry about things you don't know about? why wouldn't you worry about things you hear about a lot? So it's not surprising that that's what's happening, and that's what we need to deal with. We need to deal with that perception of risk. Now, this is what I call the tweetification of risk. Because somebody hears something, they tweet it, it's halfway around the world, it's reached millions of people before I get home from my trip. When I used to be in the government, you would find something like this, and somebody would say, well, we should write an op-ed. So we would draft an op-ed at the State Department. We'd send it over to USDA. They would send it through 21 different agencies for review. Then we'd send it over to the U.S. Trade Representative's office that would shred it and start all over again, which they could have done the first time, and by then we lost the news cycle. We weren't even part of it. So if you can't respond in a time frame, in a manner that people expect, you're not part of the conversation. And too often governments, too often universities, too often companies are not part of these conversations. The public often doesn't understand the difference between a health scare and something that's scary but healthy. And that's a problem. Now, we have to figure out what to communicate in these situations. But if you were to ask me, what are my talking points when I was with the government, I would have told you, well, the amount is minuscule, or research shows it's safe, or we're going to feed the world. Well, research also tells us that these messages turn people off. What I learned is, if you lead with science, you will lose with science. Science at the beginning of a conversation only polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree with you more. That's pretty disappointing to those of us who really like science to realize that science is actually going to turn people off. So people think a lot about risk, though. And so if you look at things that worry people, which are the bubbles here on the top, and you look at things that impact people, there's very little correlation between what we worry about and what we should worry about. But there's huge correlation between what we worry about and what we read about in the newspapers, online, and social media. Again, how could it be any different? How can you worry about things you don't know about? So it's not surprising. Another example of how this plays out, if you look at where people donate their money to different causes, on the left you have the amount of money raised by different things, and the top one here is breast cancer. And then on the right, you have things that kill us. Now you might expect a correlation between where you donate your money and the causes that lead to death. But of course, the correlation is between the causes you hear about and the causes you give to. When you hear about a cause, you give to it. If you don't, you're not going to. So again, we worry about the things we're told to worry about. How could it be any different? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you talk about food and science in a way that doesn't turn people off. Now, this is not my daughter, but it could be. She's not the most adventurous diner in the world. Now, yeah. I was giving this talk at the Milan Expo in Italy last year, and my daughter was in the audience, and she said, "You don't say that when I'm not here, right?" I said, "No, of course not." I won't let her watch this. So how do we make it more interesting? So now I'm going to give you guys a little test. Now, how many people in the room have eaten a Chinese gooseberry? Please raise your hand. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. A few people. How many in the room who have not eaten one would love to try a Chinese gooseberry? All right, we got quite a few more. Now, I am a little disappointed that the kiwi fruit has not made it to North Carolina, but I don't judge. That's okay. Because when it's a kiwi fruit, it's cute and fuzzy. When it's a Chinese gooseberry, it's a hairy fruit. Names matter. Back in 1910, some intrepid Kiwi went to China, found the Chinese gooseberry, brought it back, created a new variety, and most importantly, rebranded it. The rest is history. What we call things matters. How we talk about things matters. Now, you may have heard the idea that if a third grader can't pronounce it, you shouldn't put it in your mouth. Well, I've got some bad news for you. These kiwi fruits are filled with chemicals. And I can't pronounce most of these, let alone a third grader. And now, when you hear that idea, though, a third grader can't pronounce it, as scientists, you're probably thinking, that's ridiculous, and you have 100 reasons why that doesn't make any sense. On the other hand, you can put this image up, you can do it with bananas and eggs, and people laugh and they just get it. They understand that their initial thought wasn't right. So you can either beat them up with science, or you can lead them to knowledge. And people love to be led to knowledge. We like to learn new things. most of us don't like to be beat up with scientific facts from somebody who we disagree with. How we talk about things matters. Now, sometimes people will ask me, what's the scariest food you know? And I always say, the seedless watermelon. Unless I'm speaking to the seedless watermelon people, then I use a different example. Because you have to wonder, where do seedless watermelons come from? They don't have any seeds. Yeah, it worried me too. And so I went on the internet and I did a little research, so I'm pretty sure it's true. You start with a watermelon with 2 sets of chromosomes, and you expose it to colchicine, which is a natural plant extract, which is highly toxic and mutagenic, which is why I added the skull and crossbones, so you'll be more concerned. But that's okay. You end up with a watermelon with 4 sets of chromosomes, and you're like, oh, there's chromosomes in watermelons? Yeah, that's true. But that's okay, it still produces seeds. And then you cross that back with the original watermelon, and you end up with a watermelon with 3 sets of chromosomes, which is so screwed up it does not produce any seeds. And that's the one you eat. No nutritional analysis, no food safety evaluation. This is conventional breeding. So if somebody were out there trying to explain that using mutagens to produce watermelons with 3 sets of chromosomes when they didn't even know there was chromosomes in any of the watermelon, people would be a little bit nervous. But there's nobody saying that, so nobody's worrying about it. Now, I'm not telling you don't eat the seedless watermelons. I don't need any hate mail from the seedless watermelon people. The point is, we worry about the things we're told to worry about. It can't be any different. So part of the challenge we have is that our brains are lying to us all the time. You can't trust them. Now, we have 2 parts to our brain. We have this fast-thinking part of our brain, which gets us through our day. And then we have a slow-thinking part of our brain that does the math and does all the hard thinking. But that slow-thinking part is lazy, and it won't do the math unless it has to do the math. And so the fast thinking is getting us through a day, but it's not always very accurate. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of problems. Now, when you look at this, do the lines look a little bit wavy? It's not because you were up watching the debates last night and you're still a little phased. It's because it's an optical illusion. Now, of course, the lines are actually all parallel. Now, you guys are lab rats in this example here. Now, we're okay with optical illusions because it doesn't make us bad people, right? And so our brain lying to us in this situation, that's okay. But I'm going to give you another problem. This is a math problem. It's a math problem that any 5th grader could get right. Only 80% of you will get it wrong. That's okay. The smarter you are, the more likely you are to get it wrong. So I want you to shout out an answer the moment it comes to you. All right. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Answer? Right, 5 cents. So let's do it one more time. We're going to do the math. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more. So if the ball costs 10 cents and the bat cost $1 more, that's $1.10 plus 10 cents is $1.20. That's clearly not right. 5 cents plus $1.05. We can all do the math. Even those who said 5 cents probably thought, I see where he's going with this, right? And so the point is that slow thinking part of our brain didn't want to do the math because it thought it knew the answer. And this is happening all the time, every day of your life, and you don't even know it. Our brains are just not that trustworthy. So we need to recognize that these are not problems that other people have. These are problems that we all have. So try to make it a little bit more relevant. So these are ideas of confirmation bias. This is how we look for information. This is how we interpret the information that comes to us. So I'm going to give you an example of my bias at work. So let's say I read in the newspaper an article about some research that shows that organic agriculture is more nutritious than conventional agriculture. What am I going to do? I'm going to ask, who are the authors, who funded the research, and what was their methodology? Perfectly reasonable things to do. Now let's say that I read in the newspaper about a study that shows that organic agriculture is no more nutritious than conventional agriculture. What am I going to do? I'm going to tweet it, right? I'm not going to look at the authors and the funding and the methodology. That's what confirmation bias looks like. It is not people ignoring evidence that's so clear that they must believe it. It's digging deeper when you disagree with something, scratching the surface, because there will always be something in every study out there that you could call into question. some connection to some industry or some funding that allows you to say, aha, and ignore everything else. That's what confirmation bias looks like. And if we don't understand how we do it, we can't engage others when we think they're doing it. We need to recognize that this is just a human trait. It's not an opponent's trait. Another example of how these psychological things play out, there's something called the availability heuristic, which is just what things come to mind most easily. So if I say the word natural, what words come to mind? You think of Ebola and Zika and Salmonella. No, we think of rainbows and butterflies and happy thoughts. Now, we all know that the bad things in the world are also completely natural, but for whatever reason, the word natural conjures lots of positive associations. And so it's not surprising that when presented with a natural product and an unnatural product, that people tend to choose the natural product. When presented with an organic product and a natural product, people choose the natural product. It makes sense. Doesn't mean that it's a better product, but it's just how our minds are working. That's that fast thinking part of our brain thinking, oh, it must have more salmonella. No, that's our slow thinking part. So we have to understand how other people think in order to understand how we think, in order to be able to have these conversations. And it is important because the scientists in the room, just like the policymakers, all need to become better storytellers. We need to do a better job of telling our own story. Too many times scientists start with the science. Let me explain how we inserted the gene into the backbone, as opposed to, this is how I got into science. This is why I do what I do. We need to personalize our stories. We need to acknowledge people's concerns. In 13 years working on GM policy, I never once met a person who was anti-science. I met a lot of people who didn't trust the government, who didn't trust big business, but they all love science. They just didn't trust my science because they didn't trust me. So understanding that there aren't people who are anti-science. Saying somebody's anti-science is saying you're an idiot, couldn't we talk? It doesn't work as well as it might seem. So we have to acknowledge, it doesn't mean that they're right about these concerns, but they have real concerns. We need to find ways of connecting. Remember what I talked about in terms of land and water and environment, all of the challenges of agriculture, we all agree those are true. And so those are lots of opportunities for us to connect with others that we might otherwise disagree with. We agree on the problems, maybe we disagree on the solutions, but we're all trying to achieve the same goals. And if we can do that, we can begin to build trust. And it's only at the point that we build trust that science has any role to play in the conversation. And it's important that we get to the science, though. Now, a few years ago, I was speaking to the American Meat Science Association, 800 meat scientists, as exciting as it sounds. And I told them, I said, if people don't trust you, science doesn't matter. And if people do trust you, science doesn't matter. Stop telling people what you do and tell them why you do it. If people get the why, they often don't care about the what. So we need to explain to people where we're coming from, why we do what we do. Because then we need to eventually get to that science I was talking about. So if you look at the amount of if you ask people what direction science is going in and what direction farming and agriculture are going in, many of them think it's going in the wrong direction. It's bad and maybe getting worse. And yet when you look at the numbers, the resources needed to produce a bushel of corn in the United States between 1980 and 2011, we used 40% less land to produce that bushel. We have 60% less soil erosion on that land. There's 50% less water, 40% less energy, and 35% fewer greenhouse gas emissions. That's pretty darn good. Everything better today than it was before. The problem, though, is that we're producing a lot more corn. So we're using more land. Well, we're using about the same amount of land. We're using more water. We're using more fertilizer. We're using more insecticides. So all they see is the more. They see the eutrophication of waterways. They see what's happening in the Gulf. They don't see how much additional corn we're producing and how much more efficiently we're producing it. It's not surprising. So they don't know the story of agriculture and they just see the challenges. And so of course they feel like things are not moving in the right direction because nobody's telling the story. We have to find a better way of communicating. And The same thing is true if we were talking about aquaculture. We need to find better ways of engaging people. Now, you all probably know, well, you all know more than I do about the challenges of marine biology and aquaculture. If we're talking about aquaculture, you have limitations like disease and pollution and sources of omega-3 fatty acids. There are lots of challenges to getting us where we need to go. Solutions relate to better feed, better genetics, new sources of omega-3, and we're going to hear about some of those today. One of those is Aqua Bounty, and we're going to hear from that this afternoon. I'm not going to go into the benefits because we're going to hear a lot more from the CEO of Aqua Bounty anyway. But there are benefits, they're tangible, and they're meaningful. We could be talking about fish feed, and we're going to hear from EnviroFlight later on today as well. So there are exciting things that are happening, but how do we tell the story of these different companies, of these different products? And I should mention that both of those are majority-owned and wholly-owned subsidiaries of Intrexon. So there are things that we can do. There are products out there that can help us. Now, I'm coming to the end, and if you go back to 1969, a lot of people were worried about population growth. In the book, The Population Bomb had just come out, and it predicted within 10 years there were going to be vast famines in India and Pakistan and Africa, and that we should stop sending food aid to those countries. We should consider forced sterilization, because it would reduce the burden of human death that was going to happen, that was inevitable. Now, of course, those billion people didn't die, and it wasn't because we stopped sending food aid, it's because the Green Revolution was already well underway. By 1970, Norman Borlaug was already winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to the Green Revolution. Now, science and technology is what prevented those famines from occurring. Now, there are challenges associated with the Green Revolution, and some of those we're just beginning to feel, and some of them have been occurring for some time. But it doesn't mean that it was a bad idea to save those billion people. It just means that there are challenges that continue. Now, we went from a baby boom, but in many ways we're heading towards a baby bust. Because if you look at the number of children that were born in 1950, the average woman had 5 children. In the developing world, it was 7 or 8. Today, the average woman has about 2.5 children, and by 2050, it's going to be 2. Well, that's below replacement rate. Now, I mentioned I was coming back to statisticians. Hans Rosling is a statistician, and what he says is that year 2014 was the year of peak child. The number of children born in 2014 is the most children that will ever be born in a given year throughout human history. It's downhill after this. Now, you might be wondering, how can we go from 7 billion people to 9 billion people if we're not having more children? Because of better health and nutrition, people are living longer, and that's the entire 2 billion people that are going to be added to the planet. This is a good news story for those of you who want to be here in 2050. I'm among them. So we don't have to worry about the extra 2 billion people on the planet because it's you and me. And so this is an opportunity, it's not the problem. But population is going to keep going up, but then after 2050, you see how quickly it begins to level off. And it levels off because we're not having more children. And so it's really challenging to feed an additional billion people every 12 years. It's not so challenging to feed an extra billion people every 25 to 30 years, which is the challenge we'll be faced after 2050. Now, Jacques Duffe, the former Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, said the amount of food we need to produce in the next 35 to 40 years is greater than the amount of food that was produced in the last 10,000 years of human civilization. That's a challenge. So the challenge for us is to go from today to 2050 without cutting down our forests and without draining our rivers, lakes, aquifers, and oceans. If we can do that, in many ways, we're good forever. Because for the first time in human history, we won't need more food. For the first time in human history, we can take the productivity gains of agriculture and reduce the footprint of agriculture. Remember, between 1980 and 2011, we used 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn. Imagine if between 2050 and 2100, we use 50% less water to produce a bushel of corn. We would actually use 50% less water. We'd use less water in 2100 than we do today. Imagine if we used 40% less land to produce our corn in 2100. That's like taking all of South America out of production. Or we just grow everything organically on the same amount of land. We have options, we have choices in a way that we don't today. And so the thought that I want to leave you with before we start, I take some questions, is the next 35 years are not just the most important 35 years there have ever been in the history of agriculture, and they are. They're the most important 35 years there will ever be in the history of agriculture. And that's why we have to get it right, and that's why the work you're doing is so important. So, thank you very much. So, any question? Yes, sir.
So, Jack, are you an optimist, pessimist, or are you cautiously optimistic?
So, am I cautious, optimist or pessimist? Well, I would just
cautiously
reiterate.
optimistic.
I would reiterate, I'm a science optimist. I have no doubt that science and technology can get us where we need to go. I'm just not at all convinced that the regulatory climate is going to allow us to go there. One of the things that was raised last night was the question of whether or not new technologies like CRISPR are going to be regulated in the same way as genetic engineering. Certainly there are suggestions right now that they won't be as highly regulated, but that's what's happening here in the United States. What about Europe? We don't know what direction Europe is going to go with CRISPR and these other technologies. We don't know what direction China is going to go. Well, in China, you can't export a GMO unless you can't begin the regulatory review process in China unless the GMO has been approved in the country of export. Well, what if in the country of export they don't require a review? How are we going to ship corn if the waxy corn that doesn't need a review in the US doesn't have an approval, but China requires it to? Now there's no regulatory process to even start. So what happens in different countries will have a big impact on how this really plays out. So what happens in one country isn't enough. Yeah.
Given follow-up to last night, how do you think CRISPR, let's assume it's not regulated, and that regulation, at least in the US, is not an issue. Communications, as we kind of all, I think, agree, at least on the table, we were on the same table, agreed, is the issue. How do you communicate such a relatively complex technology that people will look at and say, we're messing with the natural, with the biological, whatever the kinds of, the complaints are going to be similar to what we have for GMOs. How do we deal with that?
So I think that there are two important points. I mean, ultimately, it's all about trust. If people trust the companies producing the products, it's going to be fine. And if they don't trust the companies producing the products, it's not going to be fine. And I'll just give you an example. Many of you are aware of the controversy surrounding raw milk. And with raw milk, there are certain health risks. And sometimes there are children who die from drinking raw milk. Now, those of us who think drinking raw milk is crazy think, aha, those people are finally going to understand that that was a crazy thing to do, and they're going to sue those farmers. But they don't sue those farmers because they believe that those farmers were doing everything in their power to keep them safe, even if something went wrong, because they trusted this farmer. Give you an example from the medical field. People don't sue doctors because they screw up. They sue doctors who are jerks. So if you look at who gets sued, if you like your doctor and something goes wrong, people don't sue them. Your doctor can be the best doctor in the world, but if he's a jerk, he will get sued when something goes wrong. So the point is that trust. How do you feel about the other? And so we need to build trust, and you build trust in a few ways. One is through transparency. One is by demonstrating that you're a responsible player. And the other is by delivering demonstrable benefits, right? So the GMOs, that has been perhaps the single biggest challenge so far, is the ability to put a product in the hands of a consumer, and the consumer says, aha, I understand why biotechnology is important for delivering that product. Now, one of the ways that that can happen, I think, is the genetically engineered non-browning apple, which is also a subsidiary of Intrexon, the Arctic apple from Okanagan Specialty Fruits. Well, it's just an apple, and it doesn't turn brown. But anybody who has sliced apples, put them in their kid's bag, and sent them to school, and had them come back because they were brown, understands that would be nice. Once you have a product that people see tangible benefits, then I think that that's what changes their mind. Because if it's okay to have a GMO apple, why would they care about GMO soybean oil, right? So if the high-value product is okay, then why would you worry about the commodity product? And so I think that delivering benefits, and it can't be delivering benefits like solving potato blight or something like that scientists say, oh, that's going to help save the world. It's like, well, but what's the benefit for the consumer? They don't see it. And so it has to be something much more tangible. It doesn't have to be so grandiose.
How does a company like, and I'll use a name, Monsanto, since everybody uses it, how does a Monsanto undo what they've done?
Well, again, they need to be more transparent, and they've begun to do that. So their executives are spending more time on the road talking to people. They're allowing people to come into their facilities and see how they do things. That was what had the impact on Bill Nye, the science guy. He walked through their greenhouses. He talked to their scientists. And so we need to engage, but ultimately we need to deliver products with benefits. If you look at the mission of Monsanto, the mission of Monsanto is to increase the productivity of farmers. Well, I'm not sure that anybody who works for Monsanto gets up in the morning with the goal of increasing productivity for farmers. I suspect most of them get up because they really want to feed the world. They really want to do something to improve the lives of people. And they do that through increasing the productivity of agriculture. And so their mission really should reflect the reason people come to work every day. And so I think that connecting their values to the values of the consumer would be a good start, and delivering products that people want.
So, and I'd just like to ask a follow-up one about the trust and all. So what kind of company, I know nothing about the company you work for. What kind of company is that?
So Intrexon is a synthetic biology company right in the middle of all of these issues. Aqua Bounty, which you'll hear more about, is a majority-owned subsidiary. Okanagan is a wholly-owned subsidiary. Biogen, which is the animal cloning company, is a wholly-owned subsidiary. So we're involved in these issues in a very significant way, because our view is the mission of Intrexon is to solve the world's biggest problems through the application of biology. And our view is that if it's a big challenge and there's a biological approach, we might be interested, because we see biology as a platform, and it doesn't matter if you're in health or food or environment or whatever. We also have 24 human therapeutics, cancer therapies, and eye diseases and skin diseases. Of course, nobody talks about those because those are all just accepted. And so we're using the technology, though, as a platform to solve big problems.
There's a word that keeps coming up a lot, and it's transparency. You used it today. But there's such a thing as too much information, too, particularly information that you don't understand. So can you delve into transparency a little bit and explain how you do it?
Yep. So just as an example, McDonald's put a lot of information on their website about the ingredients and that go into their products. And what they find is that makes people more comfortable with them, even though they know nobody looks at it. So just making information available that nobody will look at makes people more comfortable that it's available. So, that's part of what the challenge that I think companies have is they think, well, we know nobody's going to look at this, so why should we give it to them? Well, why shouldn't you give it to them if nobody's going to look at it? Let's look at things in a different way. I understand that there are some processes that people, feel will probably be uncomfortable with, but there's a lot more information that companies can be producing, can be making available. Again, just talking to people. It was many companies never engaged the public. They viewed their audience as investors, not the consumers. And so, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit just in terms of, starting this process towards transparency well before we get into sort of the really complicated issues of what to put out there. Yeah.
How can you be transparent when there's people that make a living off of attacking you? In other words, there's food babes and whatnot that have to have controversy and have to have bad guys. And so they make you the bad guy. And so you put that information out and no one looks at it except the food babe. And she twists it and tries to alarm everybody with it. How do you avoid those alarmist people that make their living being alarmists?
There are a lot of alarmist people that never get picked up by the media. So there are those who do and there are those who don't. And you have to wonder, what are the differences between those who are picked up and those who aren't? And another thing to think about is I'm not sure the exact number, but for the sake of argument, let's say there are 50,000 employees for Monsanto and there's one food babe. Most companies do not empower their employees to engage in social media, to participate in these conversations. So if you're somebody who reads in a blog something from the food babe that sounds a little scary, but your next door neighbor works for a biotech company, who are you going to trust? I mean, you're more likely to trust your neighbor. And yet if they're not actually engaged in these conversations, so you have hundreds of thousands of scientists. So when I think it's National Academies and Pew did their survey on GM labeling, 89% of scientists believe GM foods are safe. Only 88% believe that climate change is caused by man. So, but there's a huge deficit between what the scientists believe and what the consumer believes in that space. And so there are a lot of scientists who could be engaged in these conversations who already have that trust relationship. It's not me coming here and convincing people. It's your neighbor, it's the scientist at the school, it's the university, it's students going and talking to their friends. And we need to empower these people to participate in the conversation. And by and large, I just don't think most of them think it's their job. I don't think they feel empowered to do it, and I don't think they feel like they have the resources to do it. And so I think that's changing in a lot of companies. We know it's not a knowledge deficit model, it's a trust deficit. And trust comes from familiarity, and familiarity comes from engagement. So there needs to be a lot more engagement. You can't deal with the problem when it occurs. Trust is something that comes first. So you can't build trust in the midst of a crisis. And so those relationships were not built over the last 20 years. And so now all of a sudden we're saying we need them, but now is not the right time to build it. Now, it is the right time to build it for some of these new technologies. Right now, the only way we're going to get ourselves out of some of these others is by having products that people want. People will eat their potato chips no matter what somebody says are in them, because we like our potato chips. But if there's something we can avoid or say that we don't want, I'll give you an example of aspartame. Pepsi, a year ago, their head of research said, we've done tons of research, and the single reason that people are not drinking diet soda is because of aspartame. We're 100% sure that that's what all of our research shows. They took it out, people stopped drinking Pepsi. Well, it turns out they didn't like the taste of the alternative. So now, of course, they put it back in, right? And so just because people say they don't want something doesn't mean that they don't want it. And we sometimes will ask for things that will make us less happy. And so figuring out how to engage in these conversations can often diffuse it, learning to track social media so you begin to see a trend before it becomes a trend, and you begin to engage early in the process. How you frame a conversation is important. How many of you are aware of pink slime? So pink slime is lean, finely textured beef. In 2012, a mom in Texas started an online petition to get this out of the school food program. Within a month, 3 of the 4 plants that were producing the products were shut down. Well, that's because this issue was framed as health and safety of children. On the other hand, if it had been framed in terms of sustainability, it might have been a different conversation, because by shutting down those plants, we're throwing away between 400 and 700 million pounds of meat. That's more than the entire food waste of the country of Belgium in a year. So, we can choose to do that. We can add another country's waste to the waste pile, or we can have a conversation about what it means to avoid all of that food waste. And if you look at some of these pop-up restaurants that were happening in New York, Wasted, You know, they were writing articles about how wonderful it was to save 1,000 pounds of food that would have ended up in the trash and charging people $100 a plate for it. You know, that's really going to save the world. On the other hand, saving 700 million pounds of meat, well, that really might have an impact. And so there were, framing is another way of addressing this conversation and figuring out ways that matter, and that's about shared values. It's not about just shifting the attention. It's about framing it around shared values. So, long answer, short question, sorry.
A lot of us in this room have research functionality. We may also have teaching or outreach in some sense. For the research people in particular, how should we engage in this process? How do we get that information where it needs to go or in the way it needs to go?
Well, first thing I would do is I would encourage universities to reward faculty for engaging. And probably for the most part, they're penalized, not rewarded. And so, you know, if universities aren't willing to acknowledge that it's an important part of what you do, then it's going to be very hard for most researchers to do that. And as soon as universities reward you for doing it, then you're going to find that there's time in your schedule because it's not just extra work. You know, you don't have a 40-hour-a-week job. I'm sure you have much more than that. And so I think that's part of it is, you know, figuring out how to make this part of what people are doing. But, you know, not everybody's going to be an amazing speaker and going on television, but there's certainly an opportunity for everybody can become a better speaker. Everybody can tell their own story. So there are lots of things that universities can do that relate to education and training. I think every science student should go through a session on communication as just part of what they do. And you know, because it's going to be an important part of the success of them. You know, how do you put together slides? How do you tell a story? What's your story arc? How do you engage an audience? I mean, those are all things that I learned it the hard way because I had the luxury of being paid to give hundreds of speeches. You either get better or, you know, it's kind of sad. And so, so I'd like to think I've gotten better. And unfortunately, I have to leave because I'm heading to South by Southwest Eco to talk to some who may not agree with me quite as much right after this. But I welcome people reaching out to me. You know, you can get my contact information, but my colleagues, Ron and Glenn, are still here for the rest of the day. And Corey Huck, who's our Senior Vice President for Food and Agriculture for Intrexon, will be here this afternoon as well. So, thank you.